Okay, so 15, part 2, picking up with the war in 1862. The West during the Civil War, there's continued westward settlement. We'll talk more about that in chapter 17. Native Americans are taking sides, fighting. Some of the actions in the West. General Grant at this point is moving against the forts. Fort Donelson and Henry. He gets Fort Henry, which is Tennessee River. Fort Donelson, Cumberland, 14,000 prisoners taken. Also the Battle of Shiloh. It was a Southern surprise attack, April 6th. Horrible battle. Reinforcements meant the annihilation of Union troops. And so we're seeing is a lot of this up to this point, up to the end of 1862. You're going to have a lot of Southern victories, and then there's a tide that turns, and all of a sudden the North starts to win a lot more, and the South starts doing quite poorly, and turns it around. McClellan, General McClellan, his character, first of all, spent a lot of time training his men, way too much, and a lot of encouragement from Lincoln. Okay, we need to go ahead and step up, try to actually do something. So he advances on Richmond after a very, very long training time period, finally attacks in Virginia, but was outsmarted by Lee. Lee's attack on McClellan stopped him, forced him to retreat to the Potomac, and looks quite poorly on him because he had spent so much time preparing and then lost pretty badly. Second Battle of Bull Run was a big Southern victory. Lee sent Jackson to attack when the Union turned, and with that Southern victory went on to across the Potomac and was trying to gain another big victory that would convince the British to give official recognition and support to the Confederacy. Only downside was when it came up to Antietam was McClellan had acquired Lee's battle plans, had been accidentally dropped, and were intercepted, and Union met the Confederates at Antietam Creek. It was the war's bloodiest day. 5,000 killed on both sides, 18,000 wounded, and so Lee was forced to withdraw, hoping to get the British support with the win, and did not get that at all. McClellan, however, failed to pursue Lee when he was weakened and retreating, so he was removed as the commander of the Union Army and was replaced by General Ambrose Burnside. Lincoln discovered the strategy of having a reckless attack could be worse than a strategy of caution like McClellan. Burnside was way too hasty when it came to the Battle of Fredericksburg. He tries to capture it in December. He's attacked by Lee. Huge losses. They had an entrenched position, no match for the heavy weaponry, and 12,000 were either dead or wounded compared to the 5,000 on the Confederate side. So for the Confederate diplomacy, they've been trying to get European support. They were given belligerent rights, claims to international ports for a nation of war. Were not given official recognition. They did sink a few vessels to hurt Northern shipping. The Trent affair, James Mason and John Slidell were aboard the Trent trying to get recognition of the Southern government. Union ship stops them, removes the Confederate delegates. The British finally get them released, but they don't offer recognition to the Confederacy. King Cotton, that whole cash crop economic tie and persuasion did not help them out in the end. 1863, the war starts to turn against the South. Their economy is doing quite poorly. A lot of deserters, but they keep fighting. A lot of pictures. Okay, emancipation. We move from emancipation. Lincoln and many people in the North finally consider getting rid of slavery as the best way to subdue the South or to cripple their economy. Lincoln's very reluctant to commit to immediate emancipation, but is afraid of alienating the Union slave states. They have the encouragement of enlistment of freed slaves into the Union Army. They refuse to return slaves. They call them contraband of war. So they will free those in the rebel states after. We'll get there in a second. Preliminary part of the Emancipation Proclamation was that it was a military necessity. It was delayed until there was a big enough Northern victory to have enough support. Encouraged the border states to end slavery, but it did not free the slaves in those border states. The Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves in the states against the Union, so basically in the Confederate states. And we'll see the breakdown of it, or the official legal part of the emancipation with the 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865 after Lincoln's assassination, but it would outlaw involuntary servitude, hence slavery. Women in the war, most of them were nurses. Many of them had new roles of fundraising, being involved in organizations, many of them running the plantations, the munitions factories, being clerks, farmers, school teachers. 400 of them disguised themselves as men and fought in the war. Many were spies, traveling cooks, helped with amputations, sewed uniforms, raised money and supplies, and just involved in many ways. Large toll in the family, many widows, orphans. One North Carolina mother lost 7 sons in the fighting, another lost 4. It was very common for them to lose a large part of their family. A couple of different battles kind of wearing down the Confederacy. You start out with a Southern victory, Battle of Chancellorsville. Stonewall Jackson dies after this battle from battle wounds, most likely from friendly fire. There was the Battle of Vicksburg. Grant had been trying to take over Vicksburg for almost a year. It stood between northern control of the Mississippi River. It was one of the turning points of the war. With this victory, gains the port of New Orleans and most of the Mississippi River, but still want to control all of it, but it is a big advance for them. Battle of Gettysburg. Lee was trying to move north. Union wins Vicksburg and Gettysburg to really turn the tide of the war against the South. Gettysburg Address, the 7 years ago speech. Union victory at Chattanooga was another one that helps against the South. It was a gateway to Georgia. It gave them a good strategic position to move forward through the South. And all of these, basically to sum up the significance of all these battles, is they're just turning points. Finally, the war is making a different turn. You've had a lot of Union defeats, and now they're starting to defeat the South, and the South morale and supplies and everything is going to start to go down at this point. All right, so defeating the Confederacy, Grant, like I said, he's trying to make his way to Virginia. He attacks Lee, suffers heavy losses, a couple different battles. He also tries to attack at Petersburg, and this one ends in a stalemate. When come back to it later, forces Lee's starving troops basically to try and fight in the end, and Lee will finally surrender. In between all of that, General Sherman, is going to march to the south in pursuit of the Southern General Johnston. Led 100,000 men from Chattanooga, Tennessee, across Georgia onto South Carolina, and on a deliberate path of destruction. They destroyed everything in their path: fields, barns, houses, anything that could be used by the enemy to survive, anything of economic or military value, in a path that was 60 miles wide and 300 miles long. And they capture Savannah on December 22nd, moves on to South Carolina. Grant ends the stalemate in Petersburg, and we're bringing the end to the war. Towards the end, Lincoln is up for re-election. He's kind of lost some popularity. Democrats in the North had decided to nominate McClellan, who wants peace. Republicans or Unionists chose Lincoln with Vice President Andrew Johnson. After the get rid of Lincoln plan had kind of fizzled out a little bit, and he wins by quite a big margin. Like I said before, Petersburg siege will come to an end when Grant tries to force them to fight. They're starving, they're done, the South is just worn out, and Lee will surrender. So the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. Lee surrenders. Badly outnumbered Confederates were starving. Their trenches were filled with rats, with lice, lots of scurvy and dysentery. Low morale after hearing about Sherman's trek through Georgia, and so Lee's army abandons Richmond and Petersburg, trying to head south, but were cut off by Grant, and basically it was inevitable. He was going to have to surrender. Lee dresses up in his finest uniform, meeting the mud-covered Grant, and led the two to surrender. The two forces salute each other as they pass. No trumpets, no cheers, just a solemn profession and procession, and kind of a mutual respect for each other. The rest of the Confederate forces will surrender, and it was a very short-lived victory as Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater April 14th. Civil War was the first modern war. A lot of businessmen taking advantage, a lot of war profiteers. You have a huge amount of casualties. Over 620,000 die from wounds or disease. A lot of people dying from disease. It's actually twice as many as were wounded. Battlefield surgeons overworked, poor equipment. Anything from a head or stomach injury could be fatal. Lots of gangrene. This is also when they start to kind of have some new ideas with medical care. Clara Barton, one of the nurses. Well-known nurses included Dorothea Dix and Clara Barton. Clara Barton, the one that founds the Red Cross. And a lot of her ideas were to keep wounds clean. And by doing so, a lot less people died from disease and infection because you just kept your wounds or your amputations or whatever you had, just keeping those wrappings clean. New weaponry. There was artillery with rifled or grooved barrels for greater accuracy. We talked about that in class. Repeating rifles, ironclad ships, observation balloons, wire entanglements, a lot of new ideas. Why the North won? There was numbers, they had resources, they had financed it a little bit better with the tariffs and even things from the Morrill Tariff Act, which raised tariff rates to increase manufacturing revenue for American businesses. Homestead Act, which we'll talk about later. Settlement of the Great Plains, encouraging people to settle and making federal money off of that. There was the Railway Act, authorizing the Transcontinental Railroad over the northern route to link California to western states. And so all of the things, kind of summing it all up, effects of the war. Besides the huge number of casualties, you have women filling new positions. Work was better for immigrants. 4 million African Americans were free, not equal, but free. That's something that they'll be working on. The Reconstruction industry, the prices were going up. They're facing inflation. Federal government decides it was supreme over the states and use a broad use of constitutional authority. And Republican power is going to increase quite a bit. I'm going to flip through some of these slides so you can see them all. This is a good one for inflation, seeing the comparison of the prices between 1860 and 1863 and how drastically they went up. Casualty comparison of the other wars. Now this is just American casualties, not the war's totals. Again, if you ever want to see some of these for longer, just pause. I'm just flipping through them all to get through. These are the ironclad ships. On the deck of the ironclad ships. I think that's it. Alright. 15 is done. Don't forget, if you want the lecture guide, my notes, I'll try to get those on the website as well. It's been kind of finicky lately, but hopefully you'll have everything you need.